We talked about different hormones that are released from different parts of the brain. The hypothalamus releases a group of hormones. They can either release, stimulate, or inhibit the various anterior pituitary hormones, and then the anterior pituitary also secretes some hormones as well. The endocrine glands also secrete hormones. So we talked about that axis, that sort of chain of command where the hypothalamus instructs the pituitary, the anterior pituitary instructs some other gland in the body. So let's talk about some ways that can be regulated. So it can be regulated neurally. There are a lot of other neural circuits in the brain that can turn on or turn off hormone release. Okay, this may be sympathetic related. We talked about the involvement of the hypothalamus with our sympathetic response, right? That fight or flight response. And so depending on our body's physiologic state and where we are physically, we can turn on or turn off some of those hormones. We also regulate this hormonally. Okay, we'll talk about the different feedback loops, but basically the hormones that are secreted can in turn affect the hypothalamus and the pituitary. I kind of mentioned that on Friday when we looked at that schematic diagram. So for example, thyroid hormone, which we'll talk about today, is going to in turn dictate whether or not the hypothalamus releases its thyroid releasing hormone, its trophic hormone. And finally, the circadian rhythm also dictates whether hormones are released or not. We know this, that during the longer days, during the summer, when the days are longer, there's more sunlight exposure, our body looks different hormonally than it does during the winter when we have those shorter days and longer nights. Okay, the circadian rhythm dictates our sleep-wake cycle, whether we're up or sleeping based upon melatonin levels, but it also dictates other seasonal functions as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Specifically, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So I kind of mentioned what a nucleus is that cluster of cell bodies up in the hypothalamus, and specifically the SCN dictates our circadian rhythm and eventually our melatonin release. Okay, let's look at this, this flow chart here that shows us two types of feedback loops. So we should know what negative feedback is at this point, right? It's turning off an original signal in an attempt to get us back to our set point. So there are two types of feedback loops happening here. And this is just a general schematic for any endocrine organ, any trophic hormone. We're going to talk about specific examples later on. So our hypothalamus secretes trophic hormone 1, whatever that is. That is going to instruct the anterior pituitary to secrete trophic hormone 2, whatever that is. Again, it's going to be specific, right? These are specific hormones. And then trophic hormone 2 is going to encourage or stimulate the endocrine gland in question to release hormone 3, which is not a trophic hormone, but it's just a hormone. It's going to enter the blood and it's going to have an effect on some type of target tissue. Okay, now the hormone secretion from the gland, not from the target tissue level, but from the gland, is going to feed back onto the hypothalamus. That's a long feedback loop, a long negative feedback loop. Okay, it's going to bypass the pituitary completely and go right to the hypothalamus and shut off that signal, or shut off that first trophic hormone. A short negative feedback loop is if the anterior pituitary hormone, so this second hormone, trophic hormone number 2, feeds back onto the hypothalamus to shut down the release of trophic hormone number 1. Okay, so two general examples of what a short feedback loop looks like and what a long negative feedback loop looks like, okay? All right. Okay, and I just want to point out here that this is turning off this first signal, okay? And that's really important about what makes it a loop, okay? Makes it a feedback. Let's talk quickly about the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is this bit of glandular tissue. It's located posterior to the thalamus. So in this region here. And it's epithelial tissue or glandular tissue. And the pineal gland has a lot of debate around it. We're not exactly sure, or science is not exactly sure what its function is, what its role is. We know a few things that it does, but there are a possibility, or there is a possibility of some other functions that we're not quite sure of. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of controversy about its true function. It's sometimes referred to as a third eye. You may hear it being referred to as that because anatomists think it looks like an eye on this mid-sagittal section. It looks like the pupil of an eye here. Also because it's receptive to light. So it's responsive to light the way our other eyes, our real eyes are. And so the pineal gland can determine if we're exposed to sunlight, it's going to shut down melatonin release, okay? Whereas if we're in darkness, if it's getting dark, for example, in winter again, when the days are getting shorter, we release a little bit more melatonin simply because of the lack of sunlight, okay? So it's responsive to sunlight, and so that is a role that it plays as well. It also contributes to our circadian rhythm. So again, that sleep-wake cycle, this is what dictates that we're up and alert and awake. The lack of melatonin, whereas for us to get sleepy or drowsy or tired, we secrete more melatonin. And this is why elderly folks, you may have grandparents that are like this, they don't sleep very easily and they wake up very early because there's a natural calcification of the pineal gland, and so melatonin release is kind of impacted. It also plays a role in seasonal processes, things like the menstrual cycle of a woman. And if you think about it, the body has this internal clock, right? Things like a day, a week, a month, these are social constructs. Our body has no way of understanding these. And so for a woman's monthly cycle to come every month or to happen every month, there is this internal clock that's regulating that. And it's thought to be the pineal gland, right? The pineal gland and melatonin secretion. All right, so that's the end of packet 1. Any questions on this first packet? Any questions on this first packet? All right, so we're going to move on to packet 2 here for the endocrine system, and we're going to start with our first objective here, which is to describe the synthesis and secretion of thyroid hormone. We're going to go in more detail looking at how thyroid hormone is made and regulated, and then distinguish between the different actions of thyroid hormone. Okay, so let's talk about the thyroid gland first. Anatomically, it's located in the neck region. It's located around our trachea. So the first couple of tracheal rings, tracheal cartilage, is covered by this gland. It has 4 poles, two superior and 2 inferior. It makes 3 hormones. The first 2 are T3 and T4, tetraiodothyronine and triiodothyronine. T4 and T3, and these help to regulate metabolism. I'm going to talk about exactly what they do in a future slide, but just understand that they're responsible for regulating metabolism. Calcitonin is another hormone released from the thyroid, a different part of the thyroid. We're not going to talk about where that's released, but it's not in the follicle. We're going to talk about the follicle and T3, T4. We're not going to speak too much about calcitonin, okay? But it does regulate blood calcium levels, very important hormone in terms of keeping blood calcium levels low. All right, so the follicle is the functional unit of the thyroid gland, okay? This is where all the magic happens in the thyroid. And a follicle is basically this structure here. It's lined by what we call follicular epithelium. And this is a glandular type of tissue that are basically follicular cells that are lined up against each other to make this follicular epithelium. The thyroid synthesizes thyroid hormone, and until that is converted into its active T3 and T4, it is stored in the center of this follicle as what we call colloid. Okay, colloid is the storage form of the precursor to thyroid hormone, and that precursor is thyroglobulin. So thyroglobulin is this protein that is really important in storing thyroid hormone, but also in activating it in a way that it can be released into the bloodstream, okay? Now, in order for this thyroid hormone to be secreted from thyroglobulin, we need iodide. We need the ionized form of iodine. So we get iodine in our diet usually, and we iodize this to form iodide, meaning we make it into an ion that helps to move it around the body much easier. And this is what is added to thyroglobulin to make our thyroid hormone. Okay, this is why iodine is so important in our diet, okay? And if you've ever seen someone who has an iodine deficiency, you'll see that goiter, that swelling in the neck, and that is simply all of this colloid that is building up until the gland literally swells, okay? Because this is being stored and it's not being actively converted. So it's just being stored, and that's how we get that swelling. Let's talk about how we make T3, T4 and how we release it into the blood. So we start with thyroglobulin, this precursor protein that's found in colloid, right? This is the storage form of thyroglobulin. And T3, T4 needs to be iodized, meaning that we add iodide to it. So iodide comes in from our blood, from our diet, as I just mentioned. It's added to this thyroglobulin protein, and we can add one of it to form MIT, or we can add two of it to form DIT. Now, these DIT and MIT residues on this protein, they sort of coalesce together. They covalently bind to each other, and they form T3 and T4. If we combine DIT, which has two iodides, and MIT, which has one iodide, we make T3. If we combine two DITs, which have two iodides each, we make T4, okay? So now we end up with this thyroglobulin T3, T4 complex, okay? And then that needs to be engulfed into the cell. This is a follicular cell. So let me jump back here. This is one of these cells, okay, lining this follicle. It needs to be engulfed into the follicle so that we can get it across this follicular cell and out into the bloodstream. So it's phagocytosed or endocytosed. We talked about that process. It forms into this vesicle or this vacuole. And in this is thyroglobulin T3 and T4. Now, lysosomes, which are these organelles in the cell that help to break down these vacuoles, will break away the thyroglobulin from T3 and T4, and then that will be exported into the blood, okay? Now, we see T3 and T4 going directly across this membrane and going into the bloodstream. What does that tell us about T3 and T4? What does that tell us about T3 and T4? They're a hormone, yeah, and they're heading into the bloodstream. That's a good point. So it's in the blood, so it's a hormone at this point. But the fact that it's moving directly across our cell membrane tells us what about it in terms of its makeup. It's permeable, meaning it's, what type of molecule would it be? What can go directly through our lipophilic cell membrane or fatty layer? It would have to be a fatty type of molecule, right? It would have to be lipophilic, okay, to go through that cell membrane. And T3, T4 are lipophilic, okay? So they go right through the membrane. And when they get to the blood, because again, they're lipophilic, they're fatty in their nature and their makeup, they need some carrier proteins to help them move around in the blood, okay? That's not shown here, but just remember that. Now, this is all in response to another event that is taking place on this cell. So TSH, we'll talk about TSH. It comes from the anterior pituitary. This is the hormone that is sort of signaling all of this to take place. Now, what do we notice about this receptor that TSH is binding to? What kind of receptor can we call it? What kind of receptor can we call this receptor? There should be a connection from something we've talked about. So TSH is binding to this receptor that's coupled to a G protein, so it's a metabotropic receptor. That receptor is going to activate another enzyme downstream. That is going to generate some second messenger, cyclic AMP, which is going to turn on protein kinase. This sequence of events should look very familiar for you at this point, okay? That is going to turn on protein kinase that's going to phosphorylate some type of protein. All of these steps is used to bring about the engulfing or the phagocytosis of this thyroglobulin T3, T4 complex, okay? Any questions on that? TSH? TSH is a peptide hormone. It's circulating in the blood. It comes from the anterior pituitary. We're going to talk about the chain of command in a minute. But we outlined this on Friday. There's TRH, TSH, thyroid hormone. Okay?